Kia ora, I'm Nadine Higgins and welcome to the Royal New Zealand Yacht Squadron on day 3 of Vision Week. The sustainability of this land we call home is the theme of our program today. We'll be talking to experts about water, energy and earning a sustainable income while also protecting our unique and beautiful environment. This is our first year as a not-for-profit event to get New Zealanders talking about a shared vision for the future. Vision Week isn't affiliated to any one business, government entity or political party, and the results will be made available to everyone following the event. If you've been watching over the past 2 days, you will have seen that we're sharing the ideas and vision of selected viewer videos. So here's a taste of what you've had to say.
For me, a vision for 2050 for New Zealand looks like that communities are thriving. People are connected and live and work in the many flourishing centres across the country.
Looking ahead, I would like Māori at every single aspect of the creation of an Aotearoa home. I want us there. We have a great deal to offer, but there's a great mamae, a great sorrow that needs to be healed.
My vision for Aotearoa New Zealand is that we aim to become the world's foremost learning society by 2025. This shift would allow us to stay nimble, act on the full diversity of our collective wisdom, and improve productivity and quality of life outcomes for us all.
Aotearoa continues to be working as one team. We share one system, and we know that the decisions that we make affect everyone.
Draw on the wisdom of wānanga, faith communities and our experienced kaumātua, kuia and elders to inform how we can best apply the knowledge that we develop.
We have harnessing great power in our DNA. We have collective well-being embedded in us. We have our sights on ensuring our future. Why wouldn't you want that?
And you can submit your short video ideas to content@visionweek.co.nz or post to the hashtag VisionWeekNZ. Today, our second expert panel debate gets underway at 11, and we'll answer your questions during a live interactive Q&A session to follow at 11:30. First up though, when traffic, flights and industry came to a standstill globally in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, the world breathed cleaner air for the first time in decades. Skies cleared, mountains loomed clean and bright, and some people wondered whether this could become our new normal. New Zealand's Climate Change Commission is charged with finding a scientific and economically sound way to transition us from fossil fuels to a net zero carbon emissions economy. So where does sustainability start? Commission Chair Sir Rod Carr told Belinda Henley we need look no further than our own homes.
There are some initiatives which appear to give significant advantages. Let's take, for example, home insulation, where the government already has a program and in the budget announced that it was going to add some additional resources to insulate more homes. And here's an example where the climate is a winner because we can reduce energy consumption and make that energy available for other uses that will reduce emissions. But in addition, an insulated home provides health and well-being benefits to the occupants, whether the home is owned by the state or local authorities or not-for-profits or owner-occupiers or private landlords. So making better New Zealand's homes, of which about 500,000 are estimated to be under-insulated, seems like one of those projects that, so long as well supervised by quality installers, gives New Zealand a long-lived asset when we're taking on long-term debt. So New Zealand currently generates about 85% of all of its electricity from renewable sources, of which hydro is the largest, most understood one, but additional wind farms and small amounts of solar are already being brought online. It's clear that electrification is one of the known technologies that can be used to reduce our carbon footprint. Electrification for home heating, electrification for electric vehicles, electrification for space heating and industry, as well as some industrial processes that can be electrified. So investing to increase New Zealand's capacity to generate electricity from renewable sources, to distribute that electricity to where it needs to be, is a significant investment opportunity with no regrets.
And I know, Rod, the Commission has also talked sort of specifically about transport, in particular rail and ferries.
So what's of particular interest in, for example, rail is, given we have a rail network, it's what runs on the rails that matters a lot in terms of emissions and emissions reduction. These are long-lived assets, the engines that pull the trains. So electrification of the rail network and making sure that we decarbonise the fleet of engines is a significant multi-decade investment opportunity. We need to make sure that we take this opportunity to reduce the carbon footprint from our trains. The ferries that cross Cook Strait are near the end of their economic life, and the government in the budget allocated money to replace those ferries. We need to make sure that we invest wisely so that the carbon footprint from the ferries on Cook Strait is as low as possible for as long as possible. And if that means we have to defer the actual spend to make sure that we have the best technology before we lock in those emissions for the next 30 or 40 years, then the Commission would say, take the time and do it right. Because once you're on that pathway, you've locked it in for decades to come.
And as the government decides where to make these big investments, how important is it that it puts a climate lens over its long-term decision-making?
Well, the Commission believes that it is incredibly important, not just for central government in a COVID stimulus world, but for all investment decisions going forward, whether they're made by central or local government, by public-private sector. These investments now need to all be looked at through a climate change lens. They need to be looked at understanding that New Zealand, like all nations, is on a pathway to reduce our emissions from our productive and consumption activities, and that we need to prepare New Zealand for a warmer, wetter, windier, and in places drier future. Every investment needs to be looked at through that lens.
Do you worry that as businesses focus on recovering losses, that they might not prioritise sustainability and conducting their businesses in the most sustainable way they can?
I am sure that every household and every business is going to be absolutely focused on staying in business or getting back to business, and that will mean the risk of a much shorter term focus. But now is the time for leadership from government and business, that there are opportunities here to invest, to stimulate the economy, and to invest wisely for the future. That's the important part of this conversation. It's not an either or, but it can't be back to the business that we were doing 5 years ago or even a year ago. Some of those businesses are out of business.
What economic benefits could there be, for example, jobs, if we do continue to move towards our climate change goals?
Well, I think the opportunity is for new skills, as well as the increase in the deployment of skills in climate action projects and programs of work. So it's not necessarily the case that everybody is right-sized and in the right place to undertake the kinds of projects and programs that are consistent with climate action. But it is the case that much work needs to be done. And while particular roles or jobs may not come back, new roles and new jobs doing new work is going to be required. And whether that's an adaptation and the relocation of nearshore infrastructure, whether that's in adoption of new technologies to reduce carbon emissions, whether that's in understanding the science of climate change or the public policy of climate action, there are going to be significant new roles now and tomorrow to support our move to a low emissions economy.
The economy and the environment. Should one be traded off in favour of the other in a post-COVID world? Chief Executive of New Zealand's transport agency, Nicole Rosie, says that sustainability has been at the heart of Waka Kotahi's investments in low-carbon strategies for Kiwis to get around.
I think COVID-19 has highlighted some of those areas as being really important. So walking, cycling and alternate transport modes like scooters, electric vehicles, electric cycles are all becoming really good and really important alternate transport modes. So I think we've been very conscious of that and been working very actively to change our organisation and more broadly the investment within the transport system towards those alternatives. COVID-19 has really accelerated us needing to put quite a bit more money into those areas that support local communities moving forward.
And I guess those connections that you talk about are going to become really important as we move into sort of the rebuild of our economy.
Absolutely. It's at the heart of not only New Zealand's success domestically, but internationally. We still have large amounts of product being exported out of New Zealand, out of our ports and operations. They all need to get to the ports to get exported. We are an absolute enabler to both our foreign export, our domestic imports, and to our connections locally and our economy locally. So we're at the heart of a thriving, successful New Zealand. And then when you go to a local community level, we're at the heart of making it easy for you to get from A to B, to meet your grandmother or to send your kids to school or to safely get the dog to the vet. We're behind all of those things in multiple ways. Your courier company delivering the additional partner parcels under COVID-19. So we are at the heart of a successful, sustainable, green New Zealand into the future.
Well, you're a mind reader because that was the topic I wanted to go on to, was sustainability. How important is it that you have this sort of sustainability lens over all these big long-term decisions that you're making?
Oh, it's really important. I'll just give you my context of sustainability. And the Construction Accord has a view of what sustainability means. There's an international standards around what sustainability means. And broadly, they cover labour conditions. So looking after basic labour conditions across your supply chain, quality, the quality of your product. They cover procurement practices, they cover health and safety, they cover environmental aspects, including carbon neutrality, that sort of thing. Sustainability in this context encompasses environmental outcomes, carbon outcomes, and your labour conditions across your supply chain. Is at the absolute heart of what we're looking at in terms of sustainable transport, the long-term decisions for New Zealand. So the view that there's an absolute trade-off between economic outcomes and the sustainability outcomes in that broad context. If COVID-19 has not shown us anything, it's that you cannot trade these two things off, that you have to achieve both. We not only need to achieve long-term economically effective assets, we also need to achieve assets that are sustainable, of good quality, do that with the right way through supply chains being sustainable, and actually achieve environmental outcomes. And that's exactly what we're working on Waka Kotahi and have been for the last couple of years, embedding those principles deeply within our practices.
And Nicole, have your experiences during lockdown changed the way you think what's important?
Well, not really, actually. They've actually just reinforced what I already thought was important. I've always been a huge advocate for saying that economic factors cannot be considered independently from health, wellbeing and sustainability factors, and sustainability in the broad context, including environment, quality outcomes, procurement. I've always said these things are not trade-offs. They have to be integrated and the two are intrinsically linked.
Many business leaders have called for COVID-19 to be the catalyst for a new set of investments, policy and mindset that put sustainability at their core. Kaitiakitanga, being guardians of the health and vitality of land, water and resources, is a core value for Rachel Taulele. Rachel is CEO of Kono, a leading agribusiness company that seeks to be the best Indigenous food and beverage business in the world. Rachel also sits on the Prime Minister's Business Advisory Council. Rachel, you've really focused on building your business in the most sustainable way you can. Do you think sustainability is going to become more important than ever for your sector?
I think that it's one of the greatest opportunities that we have at our fingertips. And so I think that there is an opportunity for New Zealand specifically to live up to the promise that we have spent the last several decades making to the world, that we are clean, that we are green, that we do things in a way that respects people in place. So whilst I don't think that we are all doing it, whilst I don't think that we're knocking the ball out of the park, I do think that we, like everyone else, are on a journey on how to be commercial with conscience. And that doesn't come easy, because you are trying to create a profitable business that generates jobs and creates wealth for people, but you need to do it in a way that is very considerate of your place on this planet. If you were looking for silver linings, both as consumers and as businesses and as the government, we have an opportunity to reward people who are doing it well, rather than the government helicoptering money into industries or businesses who may not be towing the line as far as sustainability is concerned, or acting as a responsible business may be concerned. You know, we get to choose those things. And as consumers, we get to choose who we support with our dollars. As companies, we get to choose who we bring into our world as either suppliers or customers, for that matter. And if their values don't align, and this was an idea that I probably held quite firm to before COVID, if your values don't align, then a relationship won't stand the test of time.
We've heard a lot about the cities and how the cities have been impacted by COVID-19, but the reality is that regions are really hurting too. What's it going to take to support our regions moving forward?
I think a lot of listening will be required. I mean, the people who are in the regions know their regions, and it is no more important to anyone that they come out of this in a way that enables them to be sustainable than the people who live there and who love that region. I think that schemes like the PGF, the Provincial Growth Fund, they'll be really important moving forward, because there were a lot of projects that were started before COVID that now need supercharging in order to move forward. But having a centralised model is a part of the puzzle, but it's not the entire answer. And if I look at what's happened in Te Tauihu, the top of the south, Wakatu, who are the owning entity for Kono, Wakatu has taken the lead in developing an intergenerational strategy for the top of the south. And that's been incredibly rewarding, really hard and complex, because people come into these conversations with their own view of what's most important, and then you've got to piece those together and find something that fits most of the people most of the time. But that was led at a regional level. And I think that's really important. If we could have our regions leading the regional conversations, I think we'd get to a great place.
Our vulnerability to climate change is a particular concern for so many parts of our economy. McKinsey's Andrew Grant spoke to Greg Ward about investment in our water storage capacity.
I'm one of New Zealand's worst farmers, but I have a farm in the South Island where I live. We're thinking very profoundly about climate change, and our infrastructure that we have on the farm is not resilient given the climate changes, and we've already had 2 floods in the last 12 months that have made the farm really vulnerable. More than 90% of our critical infrastructure in New Zealand is on the coast. It's really vulnerable to climate change. What are we doing about how do we really create environmentally resilient infrastructure in the future? We're incredibly blessed as a nation with the fact that we have hydro at the centre of our network. But we know going forward that rainfall is going to be more variable, it's going to be in different places, and we need water storage for hydro in a way that we've never needed it before. How do we think that through and what that looks like?
Well, as we talk, Auckland is facing a severe drought, so it's certainly top of mind.
We saw that movie coming, and the leaders saw that movie coming. The other thing that I just hope with New Zealand, the ability to go from great ideas and knowing what is the right thing to do, actually doing the right thing.
So perhaps it's not the drought, it's not having anywhere to store the water.
We know as a nation we are going to need water storage capacity of a magnitude that we haven't, not just for potable water, but for hydro, for irrigation, for many, many things. That's the reality of what the climate scientists are telling us. We know that. I would say just around COVID, when you look at the great work that folk like the WHO and Gavi in particular have done historically, the playbooks for dealing with a pandemic are really good, and they're there. They just weren't used. No one read them. No one implemented them quite well. The magic of New Zealand is we actually did read the book and listen to the advice. And I think on climate change, it's the same. we know what needs to be done. And by the way, I would say on climate change, it's not just around abatement. We know with climate change, and this is where infrastructure, we're going to have to spend as much on adaptation as we are on abatement. That's the playbook. And I think for me with COVID, the playbook exists. The playbook's well known. We just need to make sure we actually take it seriously. Everyone knew that the world was going to face a pandemic. It was a simple matter of when, not if. It's the same with climate change. We know what's going to happen, but we acted with COVID because the reality became in front of our nose. The reality with climate change is in front of our nose. We just need to act.
The supply of clean drinking water and the health of our waterways and oceans is fundamental to our quality of life and international reputation for being clean and green. New Zealand is very similar to Scotland in terms of not only its geography, heritage and population, but also the investment challenge posed by maintaining or upgrading water treatment and management assets. Water Industry Commission of Scotland CEO Alan Sutherland has been advising Wellington Water and Auckland's Watercare, and he's been speaking with Greg Ward.
I noticed in your notes you made reference to an opportunity for New Zealand with regard to using its own burning platform. That's not something I'm familiar with, the term burning platform, but I'm always interested in opportunities. So what was that a reference to?
In Scotland, when I started, our burning platform was the industry was going to get privatised, and we were going to be constantly seen as being worse than the industry in England and Wales. And that was something that neither politicians nor water industry operatives or us as regulators could accept as an acceptable outcome. So that gave us a singularity of focus to go about and try and do something markedly different and markedly better. So it seems to me that with the Havelock North water incident and the Three Waters reform programme of the government in New Zealand, that was a sort of a modest light to the platform, if you like. A bit of a match was taken. You add COVID and the pressures on household and organisational budgets that will inevitably follow from that. And that's a bit like putting some kerosene on that slowly smouldering platform. So I think in New Zealand there's a wonderful opportunity now. I think you've got to look forward and try and look positively. There's a wonderful opportunity to set about reforming the water industry in a really effective way.
You sound optimistic. You sound as though there is lots that we can learn from your experience. There are great opportunities in front of us. It will cost, but perhaps this post-COVID recovery is the perfect time to start embarking on the reforms that you think we obviously need.
Yeah, but I think the thing I would emphasise is don't just copy what we did. And please don't make the same mistakes that we made, and have that longer term focus in place as soon as possible. Because by doing that, you make the whole process of reform less adversarial than it can otherwise be. And that, as we're learning in Scotland now, is a much better way to go.
And of course, right now, people in Auckland can't even wash their car or water their garden because of an extraordinary drought blamed on climate change. That must be a worry for you.
Well, climate change is probably the single largest focus of the water industry in Scotland right now. The rainfall patterns have been changing very markedly, and even in Scotland we've had in recent years a need to have Scottish Water assist those people who work on private supplies to top up their supply because it's been running short of water. So drought's affecting us as well. One of the things that I found really striking was that when you actually look at the water industry in Scotland and you look at both embedded carbon in the existing asset base plus its operational carbon, it's very difficult to think of any organisation in Scotland that's got a larger carbon footprint. So there's an awful lot of political focus, very understandably, on aviation and transport. They're probably seen as things that are a bit easier to do something about in some ways. But actually the water industry as an organisation, as an industry, has a very material carbon footprint that we really do have to do something about if we're serious about the mitigation of climate change. And then on the adaptation side, well, if sea level is going to rise, there will be many sewage works around New Zealand that may be under some threat of being flooded.
Tūhoe has developed New Zealand's first sustainable road building material using an actual byproduct of the pine wood pulping process. Waka Kotahi, the New Zealand Transport Agency, Whakatane District Council, Wairoa District Council and Opus Research are all collaborating on the project. Kali Himopo spoke about stewardship and innovation with CEO Kirsty Luke and Tūhoe leader Tamati Kruger.
We all pursue balance, and so once you can observe what is the living system of nature and the role that everything plays in it, whether it's moss or rock or worm or human, then we can see the everlasting way to go. Everything from a community sense of belonging and joy through to livelihoods exists in your backyard. And so if we can find the right material that's purpose is made for eroding material, and that creates a livelihood opportunity for people in Tūhoe communities, then maybe that is a way of achieving balance.
I was reading some notes about tall oil pitch. I wondered where that came from or how that came about.
We did a worldwide search with some scientist friends that we made. And then we discovered that product. And we worked on tweaking it to suit this purpose for Te Urawera. And we're at a point now that we are very confident that we should do this, and that the trial, the continuation of the trial, is something really worthwhile. We do see an end to oil and to petrochemicals and the demands of a new way of transport, a new way of roading, a new way of living. So that's what we've done. We've invested time and effort in discovering a new way of doing things and offer it to the country and to the world.
We'll have more interviews after our Sustaining New Zealand panel discussion, and don't forget to send in your questions to be answered during our live Q&A afterwards. You'll need to submit your questions on the Sustaining NZ Q&A forum on our website, which is visionweek.co.nz/forum. But for now, we cross to Greg Ward, and as you've heard today, there's plenty to sustain a healthy debate. Over to you, Greg.
Welcome now to panel number 2, and the topic is sustainability for the future of New Zealand. I'm joined today by Alison Andrew, the CEO of Transpower. On my left, Ian Proudfoot, the Global Head of Agribusiness at KPMG, and Mike Burrell. Welcome along, Mike, to you as well, Executive Director from the Sustainable Business Council. I've got 2 questions for each of you to start the ball rolling today. Maybe you first, Mike. Has the lockdown changed anything about the way you view what's important in life?
Yes, is the short version, fundamentally. I think what it's made me realise is, one, I'm very glad that we live in a country like New Zealand where we can control, to some extent, pandemics like this. And that's put us in a very fortunate position. We will come out of it earlier almost than anyone else. And it's also made me realise that it's the small things that matter. Who would have thought that a hairdresser was so important to your life? Who would have thought that all of these jobs that perhaps were invisible to us suddenly became visible? But also what it made me realise was that preparation for something like climate change becomes even more critical. You realise that these things do happen, and when they happen at pace and scale. But the good news is that you can respond to them at pace and at scale. And so for me, there's some positive things that have come out of it as well, the recognition that we can do something about our future.
It's certainly happening at pace. When you sit down and reflect on a possible vision for sustaining New Zealand, what would be your long-term vision?
I'm always a bit cautious about visions. And the reason for that is that I think a lot of it's about the values that you have and the approach that you take that builds the vision. And for me, one of the things that's come out of this shutdown and out of this crisis is the fact that if we fall back on those values that New Zealand has always held, which is it being at the forefront of many different things in the world, whether it's refrigeration and our ability to export from the bottom of the world, whether it's about women's suffrage, whether it's about our very progressive social policies in the 1930s and 40s, we've always been leaders. And I think that our vision should be about us being the best that New Zealand can be, because we will be, I believe, a beacon for the world in a time of quite huge challenge, in fact. Looking to others is not really what we should be doing at the moment. I think doing the best that we can being the best that we can be, we will be the country that people are looking to at this moment.
Alison, your long-term vision for sustaining New Zealand?
Well, I have a very positive view for a sustainable New Zealand built around renewable energy and electrification. And I think we have a wonderful opportunity ahead of us with renewable resources, abundant resources, cost-effective technology, decreasing in costs, and an opportunity to decarbonise. Very encouraged by the pan-government support for the Zero Carbon Act. And I think now we really have a chance to build an economy that's net carbon zero by 2050. And it's really up to us to make that a reality. So I think there's a very positive future. What's going to be in it for New Zealand will be more jobs, more cost-effective electricity or energy costs will be lower. There'll be less air pollution. Our balance of payments will be better because we won't be sourcing all of this imported fossil fuels. Our international reputation will be enhanced, and we'll be able to attract new investments and new things. Much to be really interested and excited about.
Well, we certainly relied heavily on many tools while we were in isolation. When you were...
And electricity was one.
That's right. When you were going through your lockdown, did that change the way you view what's important?
I think very much so. Lots of things changed with COVID, but I think it also perhaps helped remind me of what's important. It's people and it's health, and that's the bottom line. And I think building on what you were saying, it's around having really effective governance, having good organisations and having social cohesion. That's really essential when you're managing these very big events. And I think we've seen some examples around the globe of that being done very well and also not so well.
Ian, what was important for you? Because you do a lot of international travel. Did that become less or more important as you had time to think about it?
I suppose in terms of the travel, I've learned that I don't need to travel. I can still have the same impact and do it in an hour rather than 3 days and a lot less carbon, which is a real positive. But I think, for me, the lockdown really talked to a couple of things. We had everything taken away apart from our families, our shelter and our food. And for me, what it did is it's really reconnected me back with the importance of food in our lives, with how food impacts our health, how food shapes our communities and the essential role that it plays. And I think for New Zealand, that's a real important message that we need to embed into our society and go forward on, because, we are one of the best producers of food in the world and we produce great food. But we've got to make sure everything around that's right as well.
So as we make sure that everything is right, what direction should we be going in? What's the vision we should be following?
Oh, for me, New Zealand needs to be the leading producer of food in the world, on the edge in terms of innovation and the edge in terms of the regenerative sustainability of our production system, that we're producing food that's fit for a better world. But that means a couple of things. We've got to feed our 5 million first, ensure that, food insecurity has been a big part of my time over the last 10 weeks and spending time trying to work out how we get food to people that can't access it. We can't do that as a country if we're going to position ourselves. So we've got to have a society that feeds itself and feeds itself well. We've got to have a society that's been pushing hard to be the first to become the truly zero carbon food production system. And we've got to have one that actually thinks about how we bring people and talent into the sector from our own resources rather than draw them in from overseas, so we create opportunities for our kids into the future.
Well, Mike, if we're going to be a world leader, we need to manage our money well. Is there really any evidence that sustainability is good for business?
Fortunately, there's a lot of evidence. Recently, Harvard have published a series on this, and the evidence is overwhelming. Those companies that prioritise sustainability in its broad sense, and that's social sustainability as well as economic and environmental, tend to post profits almost double that of those that don't. Now, there's a self-selection there. Generally, companies that are thinking about the future are thinking about all elements of the future, and that means that they're preparing for it. So they're thinking about their own financial future, they're thinking about what they're going to need next. So it's that old saw about not skating to where the puck is, but where the puck will be. And so it's anticipating where you need to go next. So companies that invest in sustainability are generally investing in the future. The other element of this is investing in people, recognising that it's leadership in your company that is going to ultimately mean that your company is successful. And sustainability is all about investing in people. So that's, I think, another reason why companies generally do very well.
Sadly, many companies are having to lose people, let jobs go. Is there a danger that they may look at sustainability as something that can be cut early, a bit like marketing?
There's a real danger there, and we've lost a number of sustainability professionals over the last few weeks. And I understand why that is. You know, companies are having to make very difficult decisions. My hope is that they'll bring them back very quickly because they'll realise that they add real value in terms of building a future business.
Alison, in terms of power generation, let's look ahead 15 years. What are our essential needs in terms of infrastructure over the next 15 years for power generation?
Yeah, power generation and transmission, we've got to transmit it to where it's needed. And I think if you start from the demand side, there's a wonderful opportunity for us to get ahead on that decarbonising by getting into transportation and process heat. And if we can decarbonise those two sectors, we'll go a long way towards meeting our net carbon zero and our Paris commitments 2030. What has to be true? We need some policy and regulation reform to help get the right settings to encourage that new generation to be built, to also encourage that switch to electric vehicles. But I would say that that's going to happen anyway. We can make it happen faster and get the benefit from it. But if you look at all the leading car manufacturers, they're moving to that now. So it's coming, whether ready or not. And there were really good opportunities in the process heat area. So policy regulation reform, making sure the incentives, the market settings are right for this new investment. And working on things like, in terms of the policy regulation changes, some of the things like getting the RMA reforms, those sorts of changes really to support this new investment. So there's a lot we can do.
So you've called for more green energy projects, but don't wind turbines come at a high carbon cost?
You have to look at a total life cycle cost, and you have to look at overall our options to decarbonise and get rid of fossil fuels is through renewables such as wind, solar, hydro. There's a whole suite of new technologies. They are coming down really impressively in terms of cost. If you look at the learning curve for these new technologies, it's just phenomenal how much better they're getting in terms of efficiency, lower cost, lower total costs in terms of carbon footprints, etc. So you have some choices you have to make in terms of how you decarbonise. The choices we're going to have to make around still staying carbon intensive or having more wind turbines on our environment, etc. So all of these things are coming with costs and trade-offs, but we can get to that lower overall carbon footprint.
So any factors that will help us determine which choices we make?
At the end of the day, a lot of these things come down to economics. But we do have to take water allocation, for example. People are always going to be having challenges around allocating water. Do you put it into hydro stations? Do you put it into irrigation, farming, etc.? Largely those decisions will be economic, but also driven around things like water quality and keeping flows for fish, etc. So we're going to have to make those kind of decisions, and people, I think, are well versed in making those trade-offs.
Ian, there's been a lot of talk about going from volume to value with New Zealand Agribusiness. If we do that, if we manage to do that, what will our future look like?
Oh, we have no choice. We have to do that. And I think we've already been on that journey now for 10 years, and we've made some really progressive and significant strides along that journey. But there is still a long way to go. And what will it look like? It will look like a country that uses its land in the most optimal way, that actually works out how important our water is to us, and strategically we store our water around the country so that we have the water available to grow when it makes sense to grow. And it will be a story about an agricultural system that tells its story to the ultimate consumer of our product in a way that really works for that consumer. So we will build on the fact we're always been a high integrity producer, but we will build on the fact that we've also killed this disease in New Zealand, and that helps the world perceive us as safe. So we will combine the two and go out and tell a very proud story about producing safe, high quality, sustainable food that's produced from New Zealand for the world, for people's health.
You mentioned before a term, creative farming. For the layperson, what does that mean?
So I think what that means is, farming 2.0, what does the next iteration of farming look like? Some of that is going to be moving into very intensive but sustainably intensive systems, things like vertical farms where we grow under lights, because that makes more sense than growing outside in terms of the way we solve for nutrients and the way we solve for the requirement of the food that people need to eat. In other cases, that will be completely new varieties of product that we grow. So I think what we will see is farming systems evolve in response to both regulation, but also in response to what our consumers need.
Mike, you heard Ian mention the potential value of being among the first to get rid of COVID-19 in New Zealand. For you, is that a feel-good factor, or does it translate into real growth for the country?
I think done well, it translates into real growth. The fact that the Avatar crew arrived in New Zealand on the weekend, those are massive films that bring billions of dollars to New Zealand. We can repeat that quite a number of times, because sadly, this is going to be a very difficult disease to eliminate in many countries, and it's a complex disease, so that sadly will take time. From a New Zealand perspective, we need to make the most of that and say that there are quite a number of sectors where we could encourage people to relocate to New Zealand for a period of time, obviously safely, and then set their operations up here. And I think they will be surprised, as many of those in the film industry were surprised, that it's a very good place to do business. On the sustainability side, there's an opportunity for us to do all sorts of things, whether it's in food production, because at the moment people need our food. They really need New Zealand's fantastic food. So that's great for us. It's great for the fact that if we're going to move away from transport that's driven by hydrocarbons, for example, we have the ability here in New Zealand to be able to have that, because we've got sustainable electricity, and we can have more of it if we want. These are fantastic things that many other countries just don't. They don't have these choices. And we're a small country. We're only 5 million people. We can move quickly, but we have to move quickly, because this opportunity won't be there for very long. And if we squander it, I think our children will look back and think, well, what were you thinking? Why weren't you transitioning more rapidly to carbon zero? Why weren't you investing more in renewable farming systems? Why weren't you doing that? It was all there in front of you. You weren't being, you didn't have a disease to deal with. It was all in front of you. What were you doing? And I think we have to step up to that challenge and actually, be proactive.
Alison, you've heard Mike say Kiwis don't have a strong reputation for being bold, and future generations may ask questions. Would you agree now is the time to be bold?
My boys are always asking me that question. And I think if you look at how well we responded to COVID, touch wood, New Zealand has done well. We're doing well. It's a pandemic. It was acute. Climate change is a major, major problem. It's not going away. It's a chronic problem, so we're going to boil slowly as opposed to have the COVID right here in our face. But it's coming. It's here. It's this. It's no denying it. So how do we make sure now we take the steps? It's a wonderful opportunity if you think about this COVID environment now. We're used to change. We've done some great things. Let's build on that. Let's work towards that net carbon zero. Let's take those bold steps. I can tell you the longer you wait, the more expensive it's going to be and the more difficult it will be. So as we make these big investments, which we must do to get our economy going again, let's make them no regrets investments. Let's invest in the kind of infrastructure that will give us a low carbon footprint. Don't build the stuff that's going to entrench our footprint of the past.
I'd like to ask each of you about the government's living standards framework, but first, Ian, I'm still intrigued by your travel agenda. Just shed a bit of light on how much you travelled before the lockdown.
So last year I did 155 flights, and I spent over 28 days actually in the air. So I was out of the country about every third week, as well as then travelling around New Zealand. So an awful lot of time sitting on a plane.
So psychologically, what's that done to you? Are you dreaming of airports?
I've lost my second home. And the amount of time it's given back to me has been the big challenge. Actually, how do you use that time constructively? Because I'm so used to just wasting or killing time to move around, and actually now having the opportunity to use that in a really structured way has opened up a whole lot of stuff, and that's driven us down this track of looking what the now normal is for the global food system. And absolutely, I agree with what Mike was saying. When we go through this, it looks like everything's changed, but actually nothing's changed. The reality is that the big things that we face, the inequality in our society, the challenge that we have with climate change, those are still going to be the issues that we're going to be judged with as leaders when we get down the track. So, the era-defining issues are still absolutely the same.
Well, let's look now then at the government's Living Standards framework. Are we using the framework correctly? Are we getting the most from it?
I'm not convinced at the moment, and I'm not quite sure how it's flowing through into some of the policy decisions. And I suppose, the challenge is that there's needed to be immediate response, and the numbers we're talking about are bigger than we could ever have imagined before. And to be seen to be doing something, there is a need to be spending money quickly. At the moment, I think how we evolve, and particularly how the 20 billion that's not been allocated in the budget gets used, is going to be really important to then really enshrining the values in that wellbeing framework into the future of New Zealand. And, for me, when I look at my sector in terms of the primary sector, that's about how we put infrastructure in place that enables our sector to become as good as it can be.
Alison, the framework has 4 well-beings. The same question for you. Are we using it the right way?
I think fundamentally it's a good framework, and I think we all can identify and say it's a great thing to do. I think the challenge will always be in the implementation, and as soon as you have 4 variables, if you like, that you have to make trade-offs against, how I think is a good outcome vis-a-vis you may be quite different, because we have different ideas about which should have more primacy. So I think the challenge is how we bring New Zealanders with us in terms of what the right emphasis and how. But I think it's very strong and very solid that we actually weigh up those. But like Ian was saying, I think the challenge is we have to kickstart the economy and make some fast decisions. How do you make those balances? And just from my lens, where we sit in electricity, there's always a trade-off between reliability, sustainability, and affordability. You can be as cheap as you like, but it won't be reliable or sustainable. Or you can be 100% sustainable but be costly or not reliable. And I think it's quite hard for us as human beings to make multi-trade-offs. 2 things is easy, black, white, 1, 2, that's easy. But as soon as there's 3 things I've got to think about, it gets harder. And 4 things is quite hard. So I think it's encouraging, but how we implement it and how we have those conversations and how we make those trade-offs, I think I have yet to see how that's going to pan out.
And Mike, your thoughts on the framework?
Well, look, I think it's a common sense framework. I mean, it's gone by many names over the years, hasn't it? Amartya Sen talked about freedoms, and there's, so it's a useful framework. But like what Ian and Alison are saying, I think that the key to this, to me, is that the window we have is actually quite narrow. If you think about it, the government will go into lockdown virtually for the election in about 6 weeks' time. And, about 12 weeks' time, but about 6 weeks' time, that's when officials will. That's about how long we've got to get our act together. Fortunately, we've done a lot of the thinking in this space. The Productivity Commission has done a great job for us in terms of thinking about what some of these transitions would look like. Companies like Becker and others just recently have put out pieces around, practically speaking, what would that transition look like. And they've talked about transport, they've talked about industrial heat, they've talked about agriculture. So it's there. Really what it's a matter of now doing is picking that up. And I think this is where the private sector has a role to play, where it can come in and say, well, these are things that we could do in the time frame that you're talking about, practically speaking.
And there's another important party to consider, iwi. What role will iwi play in sustaining New Zealand in the future?
Oh, fundamental. Iwi are everything. If you think about iwi businesses, they're woven through the fabric of everything that we do in New Zealand. I think about the industry that I used to belong to, the aquaculture industry. A very significant part of that industry is iwi owned. And if it's not iwi owned, it's iwi enabled. And I would like to, I suppose, reach out to those leaders and say, this is an opportunity for us to look beyond the normal time horizons, because iwi look out in terms of decades and centuries. And that's exactly what we need at the moment. We need that kind of thinking.
Alison and Ian, anything to share or build upon in terms of iwi?
Just building on that in terms of the long-term view and the Māori view, Papatūānuku, the land, environment, that's just got to be so much of how we think about sustainability in the future.
Yeah, I've been incredibly lucky to be part of the Te Hono movement, which is a movement of primary sector leaders that really incorporates and brings together in real practicality the traditional farming sector and the iwi farming and agriculture sectors. And as we're merging those two, the opportunities available to us are significant. And, iwi as a partner in the future of our agricultural system, as both the bringer of the fundamental principle we're going to use, which is te taiao, and the balancing of land, water, air, living things. It's going to be critically important to the future of the sector, how the two work together.
Another one for you, Ian, something I want to know more about, impact investment. Apparently it's a global trend. What is it, and are we doing enough of it here?
Well, it's amazing when you look at the food sector. We are seeing huge amounts of money coming into the global food sector in terms of impact investment. In 2018, 2019, it was around 16 to 17 billion US dollars. And that's people that have made a lot of money outside of the food sector that are now coming into the food sector and saying, actually, you're the one part of the global economy that's not digitized, but is still doing things pretty much as you did them a couple of hundred years ago. If you look at how we farm today, it's pretty much how our great-grandparents farmed, and saying this is a sector ripe for disruption. So we're seeing it in terms of the types of food we think about eating. We're seeing it in terms of the introduction of digital systems into agriculture. We're seeing it in how we use water. So all of that's coming together, and really what people are trying to do is say, right, the global food system needs 821 million people hungry every day. How do we do something to address that? What impact can we have? It's the easiest part of the global economy to have impact on, and my belief is it's the easiest part of the New Zealand economy to have impact on as well.
Alison, we may have touched upon this earlier, but there seem to be quite a lot of options to double our green, renewable energy sources. What would that mean for consumers?
For consumers, there's lots of choices, and there's going to be more opportunities for consumers to be in control of their own energy. There are lots of opportunities, as you say, for us to decarbonise renewables such as wind, solar, more hydro, and we've got some great geothermal resources. But there's also the opportunities for solar on roofs, batteries, electric vehicles, and we just predict a future where not too far away there'll be lots of 4 million or so devices by 2030, 2035 connected to the grid, your car, your home devices, battery, solar. And that'll help us too in terms of much more affordable future, because that will help us manage peak on the grid and have much less investment in central generation and transmission that we would have needed. But also we predict a future where it's going to be more affordable. We've done some rough numbers to say if you take a household with 2 vehicles and you say by 2035 one of those is electric, you should have about a 25% reduction in your overall energy bill. So there's a lot of, and energy efficiency is doing things. So we see a very affordable future, and one where consumers have much more choice and are much more interactive if they choose to with the system, so that overall cost will come down. It'll be much cleaner, much greener.
And Mike, can you give us some practical examples of how we can build sustainability into the economy?
It starts, I think, in 2 ways. The first is making the right policy choices and not having disincentives to take these choices. And EV would have to be the classic example of electric vehicles. Why disincentivise the uptake of electric vehicles, which we currently do? And so it's really about removing those barriers, the policy barriers, and making sure that we're moving in the right direction. And then related to that are the investment decisions that the private sector makes, as well as the public sector, around buying decisions. So prioritise electrifying your fleet, for example. That's a really good place to start. It's relatively easy to do. The other component for private companies is to recognise that it's really about adapting to the change, recognising that this change is coming. It's coming. And it's like trying to say, I really want to hang on to my typewriter. I love my typewriter. I feel passionate about my typewriter.
Have you still got one?
I do, actually. It's a collector's item. But actually, I've got to let it go, because it's much more effective for me to use a word processor.
Well, Ian, change and disruption is on the way. What's your closing message today?
Well, it's interesting, just building off what Mike was saying. To me, actually, when you think about this, it's fundamentally a governance issue. It needs leadership, and it needs leaders to be prepared to stand up and actually face into these challenges. And, you know, I think one of the challenges I see in New Zealand boardrooms at times is there's a lot of time spent talking about what's happened in the past and very little time spent about talking about what the future looks like. So having the boldness of our leaders and our governors to actually change that agenda so that more of the time is spent looking forward and focusing on what the future holds, and actually identifying those signals of change and building them into how your strategy is going to look. That, to me, is how we move forward. But I believe if we can do that, then this country has a huge opportunity in front of us.
Leadership isn't always easy with a 3-year political cycle, though, is it?
No, and yeah, as a Brit, I struggle with 3 years. It doesn't make sense to me.
and annual reporting cycles for corporates.
Yeah, and you know, but actually, you know, coming back to what Mike said at the start, when you look at some of this information coming out at Harvard, the companies that are being prepared to look through those 3 monthly, quarterly reports and actually think about the long term are those that are having the greatest success. So it is, leaders that can tell a story and articulate a vision so that people will go with them becomes really, really important to me.
Having a vision. Alison, your closing message
Might I
today?
just say one more thing too? I think one thing we haven't talked about is supply chains, and we're having a really hard look at supply chains have been disrupted. Resilience, and I think there's now more importance and weighting being placed on local supply chains, local resilience. So I think that's an area that we can learn from COVID in terms of our climate change, etc., around us thinking about our global supply chains and thinking about our national security in that context.
So doing more for ourselves?
Where it makes sense, but just being very aware of where our supply is coming from and how we make sure we have resilient and reliable supply chains.
Good. So a closing message from you.
Closing message, I think that we have a very exciting opportunity ahead of us to build towards a net carbon zero economy by 2050. It's all there in front of us. We need to make smart choices, invest well, and think about that long-term footprint. We're very lucky in New Zealand with 85% plus renewable electricity. Electrification of transport and process heat is the only way, along with others, that we're going to meet our net carbon zero and our Paris commitments. So we have to get on with it. There are things we can do with policy and regulation to really enhance that. But it will be a more affordable, more jobs, more reliable system where we can all participate in our energy choices for the future. But I think we also have to think about how we as a nation and as a sector and as a nation are going to be able to respond to more of these type of shocks that are going to come to us in the future.
Yeah, we don't even know if there'll be a vaccine, but I suspect that your final closing message will be one of optimism and positivity. Mike?
It's a mix. I suppose the first thing for me is that bad things happen. And I think we'd forgotten that. Our grandparents certainly hadn't, and our great-grandparents hadn't. They lived through depressions, they lived through wars. They knew that bad things happen, and that actually you put some money away for a rainy day, and that you're stoic about it, and you work through it. We'd forgotten that. We've been through 70 years of unprecedented growth with really no major conflict. And so for me, it's about remembering what they learned, which is that in the end, sustainability is about making things enduring. Bad things happen, prepare for a rainy day, look forward, look after each other, and the economy will grow.
So starting with you, Ian, in the next couple of months, co-government, what would that look like to you if you'd had a chance to think about that? What would co-government look like in the next 2 to 3 months?
I think in the next 2 to 3 months, what I would like to see is a very rapid assessment of what the future market opportunities are for us, and connecting those back to what that will mean in terms of the natural resources we have in New Zealand, what our human resources will be, and what our economic resources are, and aligning ourselves to say, well, what can we do today that has the best opportunity? What can we take off the shelf now that will give us a benefit for creating jobs for people, improving our environment, and giving us economic resilience? And I think we can do that quickly and actually see that we've got some gold sitting in those deep resources of those organisations that we can deploy quickly.
Oh, Alison, do you share that optimism that these are days of great uncertainty?
I was going to flick this way while I'm still processing.
Thanks, Alison. Look, we've been doing a lot of thinking about that. And the first thing I'd say is that we understand why the first wave of investment had to be so pragmatic. Clearly, we did need to prime the economy. Clearly, we needed to be generating jobs at a time when we were losing so many. So we understand that. But this is the moment for drawing breath, for reaching into organisations to find those projects that have been sitting there for quite some time that are a bit more far-sighted. Now, from our perspective, they should do exactly as what Ian's described. They should be generating jobs and employment. They should be ensuring that we get the growth that we're going to need to get us through this crisis. But they should also be about investing for the future, because we need to remember where that money comes from. We are literally borrowing from our children and our grandchildren. In the meantime, we also need to be looking at the private sector side of this, that's the government balance sheet. What do businesses need to be doing? And they should be doing exactly the same thing, which is looking ahead and saying this is an opportunity for a breath, to look ahead and to do those things that we were thinking about doing one day, but starting to do them now. So not leaving it all to the government, actually saying there's some great things that can happen on the business side.
So Alison, wise spending, wise investment for future generations.
Yeah, I think they're in a hell of a position. If I just think about the government, how do you address the short-term problem of the economy going to hell in a handbasket, people losing jobs? It's just, so the response they've taken, while it might not be optimal, has been, I think, what's had to happen. Yes, we can pause for breath, but we haven't got too long. And how do we actually make sure that the projects that we're going to invest in, as you say, our children will be paying them back and they'll be reminding us.
They will be.
How do we make sure that they are not just shovel ready, but they're shovel worthy? But we haven't got time to muck around and have big think tanks and think about things. I think selfishly, well, for all of us, climate change is real, it's happening, it's now. There's some really obvious things we can do to electrify our economy to really start to solve those problems. So I think there will be other things like that, but there are some big bets you can make that are very no regrets. We have to solve these problems. Let's get on and make sure the investments we make are enduring, do create jobs for the long term, do really invest in our economy and create that future that we need. But let's be careful and be strategic about it and think, what does 2050 need to look like? And how do we build that legacy so it's not just a debt that we sit there that disappears when our incentives go away?
Well done. Short notice. Thank you all.
Hello and welcome to Vision Week New Zealand. This is the second of our live Q&As. The topic today, obviously, sustaining New Zealand and taking a closer look at sustainability are our guests Mike Burrell, the Executive Director of the Sustainable Business Council, Alison Andrews, the CEO of Transpower, and Ian Proudfoot, the Head of Global Agribusiness for KPMG. Thanks to all of you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Alison, I'm going to kick off with a question for you. We've already had a lot of questions in from people joining us online today, which is fantastic. I want to start with a comment that Rod Drury made earlier this week. He was talking about the opportunity for green electricity through pumped hydro. This concept that we could pump water up to a dam overnight when electricity is cheap, and then use this as a battery for when we need additional electricity. Alison, is that a realistic option for us here in New Zealand?
We're spoilt for choice in New Zealand, I think, in terms of opportunities to get more renewable electricity. Right now we have some great hydro, we have geothermal, we have wind. We're about 80-85% renewable, and we have options for a lot more wind and more solar. Pumped hydro would be very useful as one of the solution possibilities for what we call a dry year risk. We don't have a lot of storage in our hydro lakes, so when we have very low inflows into particularly the South Island lakes, we can run out of fuel, if you like. So having a backup, at the moment we firm our low hydro flows on thermal fuels. Pumped hydro can be a good option, but there are a whole range of opportunities out there, and I think the market will choose what is the most cost-effective solution for meeting our renewable needs.
Right, question for you, Ian. We've had a comment from Tim Wilson asking about the controversial Rutaniwha irrigation scheme. If Alison got her hydro lakes to store water, is there a more sustainable way that agriculture and our food producers could use that water?
Oh, absolutely. I think, there's probably become a bit of a mismatch in thinking around water and irrigation systems and the agricultural outputs of that water or how it's used. We can use that water, and if you think about it, we need two things to grow. We need water and we need sun. And the reality is that if we've got the water, we can use it to grow a whole variety of products, and we can do that in an incredibly sustainable way. So I think it's important, as we're thinking about what the future looks like for New Zealand, that we're recognising we have parts of the country that are now heavily water constrained. The Rutaniwha and Hawke's Bay being one particularly heavily water constrained area, and working out how we actually build that water storage so that we are able to keep growing in parts of the country that have great source.
And I guess especially important years like this where there's pretty serious drought right around the country.
Yeah, and I think when you look at it, we've got droughts now in Northland and Waikato and in the East Coast, all regions that historically have been very water secure. They've been historically wet regions. But if you go back over the last 5 years, we've seen droughts in most of them on a couple of occasions. So we don't have the certainty of water where we used to. And if we want to use our land in a way that's sustainable and productive, we need to make sure we've got water.
Right, moving on to waste, and a question for you, Mike. We've had this question from Mark, Hona, Felix and Emma, looking for solutions for New Zealand managing its own waste, and how can we best manage our waste in the most sustainable way possible?
I think what we learned over the last 2 years is that New Zealand wasn't necessarily managing its waste in the most sustainable way possible. So that was a wake-up call when we realised we were exporting a lot of our waste. What I understand from the waste sector is that being able to process that in New Zealand is no small task, that the economics around that mean that you need to get scale, and that any way that we were going to do that would need to make sense economically. So the first thing is to work out what that would need to look like, and then to ensure that any obstacles that allow us to do that, regulatory obstacles or policy obstacles that allow us to do that domestically are removed, and that can happen. But what we're also seeing is that New Zealand companies have already started this move to much more sustainable processes around waste management, and a number of our members are already doing this, whether that's simply around electrifying their fleets and making sure that the way that they move waste around is sustainable, or whether it's about how they deal with the end product. That process has been well underway for at least the last 5 years. But there is more that we could do, and I think that it really is about us sitting down with the government and saying, well, what makes the most sense from a New Zealand Inc. point of view in order that we process as much as we possibly can on shore.
Ian, we've had a question from Usha asking how science and technology can work together to reduce our agriculture emissions. Agri is obviously one of New Zealand's biggest opportunities. Where do you think these things need to coexist and work together for the best possible outcomes?
I think the primary sector in New Zealand's food and fibre sectors have a pretty bold vision for a fit for a better world, which is about a vision of how we use technology to enhance and develop and deliver a completely new way of doing regenerative farming. We have an aspiration to move to zero carbon, and if we can get there quickly, then that aspiration becomes actually an incredibly valuable economic positioning as well, because people around the world will pay for zero carbon food. So the ability to move quickly and bring science to bear on all emission areas, but particularly, our biggest challenge is around methane. And that's where, if we can work out how we reduce methane emissions from animals and do that in a way that's both sustainable and retains the productivity of the animals, then that unlocks a huge potential for New Zealand to get more value out of the products we grow, so we can get more while doing a lot less with our land.
Alison, this is a really interesting question for you from Elizabeth, Victoria and Sherilee. They're talking about a shift in mindset when we're making decisions about our freshwater, about our waterways. Instead of thinking it in terms of trade-offs, we think it in terms of shared benefits and a more holistic approach to our thinking. What are your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. We have to think about holistically and what's going to be the best value. I think water, particularly in our hydro systems, is a really important fuel, if you like, for our electricity system. And it really helps us in terms of being renewable, and it's a pass-through, so it's not lost. But it needs to go through our penstocks and through our generators to make the power. So anything that's diverted off from that does mean we have less electricity. So there is a value for us in using the water through our hydro systems. But absolutely, New Zealand needs to have the conversation around how do we want to use our water. There's lots of different and valuable ways we can do that. How do we make the right choices? How do we make where we can so we can do many things with our water, but in ways that actually recognises that we have to treat water as an important resource and make sure we're making really good decisions around it. As Ian said, things are changing, our climate's changing, things are happening. Water, we've always thought, I think, in New Zealand about being very, it's always there, we don't have a problem. I think we're going to have to think about it much more carefully, mindfully and strategically in the future.
Okay, Mike, question for you from Saul. He's asking about this concept of a Green New Deal, which is an idea that's being discussed in the US to transform their economy in a more greener way. If that would provide the transformation we need here in New Zealand?
Well, certainly we shouldn't be squandering the opportunity that's been presented to us. We need economic stimulus, we know that, and that's happening globally. That means we're going to be spending billions of dollars of our children's and grandchildren's money that they will have to pay back in 20, 30, 40 years' time. So we should be spending as much of that money as we can on today and on them. And to me, that means that something like a Green New Deal makes a lot of sense. For me also, though, it needs to reach across the political spectrum. It needs to be something that most parties can get in behind because it needs to have longevity. It's no good to just go with something that's short run. That to me means finding some middle ground where the various different political parties can agree on a framework that will then help with that transition. Fortunately, we've got some long-term instruments that we can use. There's obviously the Climate Change Commission itself. We've also got a range of other commissions, including the Productivity Commission, which takes a long-term view, and also the Infrastructure Commission. All of them are doing the same thing, which is taking a 30-year time horizon and saying, what does New Zealand need to do today to get there? Part of that will be about investment and those investments that come out of that so-called New Deal. Part of it will be about policy. But whatever it is, the world is changing anyway. It was going to be changing regardless of climate change. It was going to be happening anyway. We were going through another industrial revolution anyway. But then when you add climate change to that, you're talking about a very complex future. So what we do today will have a very real bearing on what happens next. Practically speaking, that means that the government of today needs to really think about the things that it can take off the list that were already there that are good things to invest in today. I'm not going to go through the long list. They know what those things are. But it makes sense that we actually start making some of those investments today. But it won't stop with that particular expenditure that we're making through what's called Wave 3. It will continue on over the next 5 and 10 years. Whatever it is, we've got some very big targets that we have to hit by the end of this decade. The longer that we delay those targets, the harder it will be to meet them.
This leads me on nicely to a question for you, Ian. You have talked about the need for governance to step up and be more future focused, to articulate a really clear vision. How do you think that's going to happen, and how is it going to happen quickly?
That's a really good question, because one of the challenges we have in New Zealand is our governance pool is relatively shallow, and there's some great people in that pool, but they tend to move in little groups between companies. So I think one of the things we need to be prepared to do is, and this is the perfect time to do it, is bring diversity of thought to the table. And if we look globally, what we see is a lot of organisations recognising that they've got a core governance group, but when they're thinking about specific issues, they bring in world-class experts, bring in the best people to help augment their conversations, add to their discussions, bring a different perspective. And I think that's what we need to have. We need to have boards that are going to be much more open to bringing diversity to the table. And this is the time to do it. And if we look back to the organisations that accelerated out of the GFC as opposed to struggling out of the GFC, they were the ones that brought diversity to the conversation. And as a consequence, they pulled the right levers harder and pushed stop on things that weren't going to be relevant. That's what we need to do over the next 6 months. And I think, having boards that are prepared to recognise they don't have all the answers is probably critical.
Alison, we're seeing a lot of interest in electrifying our transport fleet, but there are concerns about whether our grid can handle the extra load, and also the change to two-way electrons, for example, people putting solar panels on their roofs. What are your thoughts on that?
We're absolutely up for that challenge, and we'll make it happen. The grid itself, the high voltage grid, is in relatively good shape. We are proposing to do a piece of work looking at a net carbon future, what the grid would need to look like, to give some view to help participants understand where our constraints are, where it makes sense to put new generation. But we're very lucky as a country. We've spent quite a bit of investment in getting our grid in a really good shape with the update to our HVDC link across Cook Strait. Our new lines are in and around Auckland. So we're in a good position. We have identified where we think the investments will need to be, and we're really ready and willing to be able to put those investments in. There's going to need to be some good investment too in the low voltage distribution systems through our electricity distribution companies, and there's a lot of investment and need that needs to go in there. But it's a very exciting future with solar, EVs, batteries. If we get this right, and there's no reason why we can't, with those kind of new participants and consumers will help us manage load, drop down those peaks, so we can actually avoid overbuilding our infrastructure. So if you look at what we're predicting out to 2050 to get to our net carbon zero with electrification, a 60% increase in demand, but only a 40% increase in the peak, which is really important because you build for the peak. So if we can make our peak increase less than the overall demand increase, it's a much more efficient way of increasing our infrastructure. So yes, I think the grid is absolutely up for enabling this exciting future.
Ian, a question for you about impact investors in the forum. Saul is asking about whether there needs to be more integration with iwi and iwi values to better guide where we make these investments and the impact they have.
I think when you look at it, there is a huge number of impact investors, and the fact that in New Zealand we have organisations within our primary sector that are taking, not just a 100-year vision, but a 1,000-year vision around what they wish to do with their land and how they wish to be seen as kaitiaki off that land, I think aligns us very well to secure relationships with some of the organisations that are seeking to change the global food system. I think when you look at the overall primary sector, the alignment of where the sector is looking to go with iwi or with Maori values is getting tighter and closer. So the industry vision that we now have talks about taiao as a concept, that ability to balance the land, the water, the climate and other living things in a way that is there, sustains them for the long term. And if you look at many of our large sort of traditional sector processes, they're adopting that vision and that core principle into their strategies that they're working out at the moment. So I do see that alignment coming. Is it fast enough? No. Could we be taking it further? Could we be thinking more holistically about what is the unique New Zealand system? Yes, we could. But I think that's on the agenda for the sector to pursue pretty vigorously over the next 12 to 18 months.
Mike, a question for you from Jemima, who's in our Sustainability Forum. She's talking about our huge coastline as a possible place for blue carbon sequestration. Excuse me. Can you explain what exactly this is and how we can make it happen?
Right, well, it's a very technical question. So first of all, the concept of using our oceans for sequestering carbon has been around for a long time. I used to work in the aquaculture sector. In fact, aquaculture is one of those areas where you can sequester carbon, basically through the shells, for example, of shellfish. So there's a range of ways in which you can do it. The challenge historically has been to do it at scale. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that you need to do it all in one place, but it does mean that you need to do it system-wide. So in New Zealand, really, that's about taking a view of the oceans that's quite integrated. Because just as with aquaculture, you need to place that in the appropriate place and it needs to work in with other sea uses and ocean uses. So the same is true with carbon sequestration in waterways. I personally think there's a huge amount of opportunity there, but I think that currently that's not the way that we've viewed our oceans. And so that would take a bit of a mind shift, and it would also take, I think, some legislative change as well to allow us to do it. We could do it though.
Alison, question from Victoria asking whether hydrogen or fusion energy can be looked at for alternative power sources.
Yeah, I think there's all sorts of opportunities coming up in alternative fuel sources. Those are a couple. The exciting thing about this is that there's so much new technology coming. I don't think I can sit here and say what's going to be available in 2050. That's anything. The market's moving so fast, technology's developing. If we could find some of these new technologies which are just going to be really cost effective, low emissions, and just fix, of course we would use them. We've got and talked about pumped hydro, geothermal, wind, solar. At the moment, the technologies that are looking most promising in the renewable side is the wind and solar. Electrification of the heavy transport is becoming more difficult, and that's where something like hydrogen may play a good part. But I think rather than picking winners, there's just a lot of development happening offshore, overseas. We have to be open to ready to embrace technology as it comes available and adapt it and make it suitable for New Zealand. So yeah, there's a lot evolving in the space, and the cost curves in terms of how much more cost effective technology is becoming are super impressive and show no signs of abating. So I think we're really being advantaged by all these different options that are developing out there.
Very exciting times. Now, Ian, you were bold enough, or perhaps brave enough, to mention on the panel which we saw earlier about possibly extending our political term to 4 years. What would be the greatest stability that this would provide government in their direction for the agri-sector?
It's not just for the agri-sector. Personally, I think it's for the whole economy. It's about, having some degree of certainty. And if you talk to anybody about investment, it's the confidence around the regulatory environment is critical to how they choose to make investments. In our environment in New Zealand, we've been generally lucky in having a 3-year term, but we've had governments that have survived for 6 or 9 years. So that has given us a degree of certainty. But there is no guarantee that continues. While I don't want to move to an environment where we don't hold politicians to account on an appropriately regular time frame, I think what we do need to be thinking about is having a platform that enables us to take intergenerational investments. And as Mike has already mentioned, we're looking here at spending $50 billion of our grandchildren's money. We need to be making that investment on the basis that we're actually not going to pivot in 6 to 8 weeks' time around what some of those investment decisions are. So, we need to have an environment now in New Zealand that enables us to have the runway to make the big decisions. In 3 years, when we look at it, just isn't long enough. It gives us a working time frame of probably only about 18 months in every 3 years where real decisions can be made and progress taken. So I'm very much a 4 or 5 year term for political office. To me, makes a lot of sense.
Great. Mike, question from Angela, looking into the regions. Philippa is saying that we need to move away from Auckland and empower Invercargill for its deep port, clean water and abundant electricity. And I guess this goes into a bigger question around how do we bring communities and regions into alignment with our bigger national goals?
A really good question, and close to my heart. My wife's from Invercargill, I'm from Greymouth, so I'm very much focused on regions. There's no doubt that much of the growth that New Zealand needs and much of the change that's going to drive our growth is going to come from our large cities, so from Auckland in particular, but Wellington, Christchurch and Dunedin as well. But what's also clear in New Zealand is the massive growth that we've seen in certain regions, and I particularly think of those ones like Tauranga and others, where you've seen massive growth over the last 20 years. For me, what enables that is a combination of different things. Partly it's about infrastructure, partly it's about thinking about the connectivity that allows those regions to be able to flow, and partly it's about leadership. In the case of Southland, for example, I wouldn't presume to know what the needs of Southland are, but I think it is about ensuring that we are listening to our regions and that we're taking what they are saying into account when we're making these national decisions. Now, that's something that we can do through national plans. And I know at the moment there has been quite a lot of focus with the current government and with previous governments on trying to do things on a region by region basis. I'm not sure that we're that good at integrating that though and looking at it in terms of a national plan. Now, we're able to do that through our RMA and other legislation, but we haven't done a lot of it. And I think that's where we could do a lot more.
Alison, a question for you from Victoria, asking whether our system is agile enough to make the changes needed to invest the $20 billion COVID fund in a timely and balanced way.
That's a great challenge, and I'd be naive to say, of course. We need to be more agile, and we need to be able to make good, timely decisions. But I think the challenge more for us is, what would it need to take for us to do that, and why can't we be? I think as a sector, particularly if you look at my business, infrastructure, we build big things that take a long time and cost a lot of money and require a lot of time to plan and build. We need to get smarter. We've identified the need in our Whakamana i Te Morihiko, which is a look out to a net carbon zero 2050 and the role electrification plays in that. We've identified we need to be more nimble. As you get people putting solar, batteries, things on, these things are going to be happening fast, and we have to be ready and able to enable them. So it's a great challenge, and I think the challenge for us is to say, why couldn't we be? And we all need to be thinking smarter and finding ways to actually be making some bold decisions. But the great thing about climate change is it's right here, right now. We're facing this issue. We know what has to happen. Electrification, for example, has a key part to play in that, and there'll be others. So we should just get on and make it happen. And yes, the challenge is we do need to be more agile, and we do need some of the policy and regulator settings to be able to help us be more agile and more flexible to make those bold moves.
Ian, how do we incentivise agribusiness to pivot and I guess prioritise value over volume?
I don't think there's much incentive needed to do that, because it just makes sense. You know, if you can get more money for doing something with a greater story or more attributes behind it, then I think, you know, all of our businesses are not sitting around. They are all doing the hard work to try and add more value to their products. You know, the bigger question for me is, how do we incentivize a pivot so that we actually do what needs to be done in terms of the environment, in terms of climate change, and really take the steps forward in those areas. And, you know, that's where we need to think very carefully now about this time we're making investments. If we look globally, a lot of development in agricultural sectors across the world in terms of progressing towards more sustainable futures is being funded through government subsidy. Now, I'm not suggesting we move to a framework of government subsidy, but we do need to think about how we support the farmers to get to where we want them to go to, rather than sort of thinking about, you know, why they are where they are today, and what's got them there, and, you know, penalising them for where we are rather than focusing on the outcomes. And I think, you know, that's where we should be thinking very carefully about how we do move forward at speed.
That actually leads on to another question which has just popped up, talking about the practical steps that you would recommend New Zealand take to deliver both a more sustainable food system and also tell our story to ultimate consumers.
First thing is, we need a national food strategy. We haven't had anything that approaches a national food strategy since 1995. We're one of the few countries in the world that relies on growing and selling things for creating so much of our wealth. And yet we are one of the few countries that don't have a strategy. And I think, you know, we've seen the impacts of not having a strategy in some of the food insecurity issues that we've seen over the last 3 months. Secondly, we need to get far better at telling our story. And that's about making sure that the attributes that we have around our products, how we grow them, the science behind them, the quality that they bring, are all verifiable to internationally recognised standards. So that's about getting the data in place and then being able to verify that data and share it in a way that's compelling to our consumers. And the third thing is, we just need to make sure that the aspirations we've already articulated in terms of the environment, the track that we want to take in New Zealand towards being the best producers, not just of food, but best producers for the world, that those aspirations don't change. We've just got to work out how quickly we can move towards them. And, you know, that's where I think the government can help the industry accelerate the pace we move towards those aspirations.
Alison, you've touched on this already, the need for people to move from petrol to electric cars and the uptake of this. What about when it comes to public transport? How important is that we really push to electrify our public transport fleet?
I think it's really important, and I think technology here is our friend. And there are some great technologies I've seen for electric buses, for example. hydrogen buses. There's lots of different options out there, biofuels as well in that space. And I think if we are going to use more public transport and encourage people to do that, because of course it is a much better way of being more efficient around how we're moving around, we need to make sure that those public transport, whether it's buses, trains, planes, we try and decarbonise and move to zero carbon fuels as quickly as possible. The challenge is harder than the light vehicles, cars you and I drive easy, and the technology's right there now, and it's virtually cost neutral now to move into electric vehicles, and they're cheaper to run. So that's a very, very close to that tipping point of being compelling for us. More challenging in the heavy vehicle fleet because of the way it's batteries and things, and that's where the alternative fuels come in. But it's an area where we need to move more people onto public transport. We need to provide more useful means for people to get around, and we need to decarbonise that, and there are solutions. Some of them are a bit more challenging, but they're coming.
Mike, some people seem to be afraid that green solutions could lead to less jobs. Do you have a view on how greening our economy could in fact create more jobs and what they might look like?
Sure. First of all, I don't think it's about greening our economy. I think it's just about making it more sustainable. And by that I mean that when people talk about greening the economy, they immediately turn this into an ideological debate. And it's not an ideological debate. It's just fact. The fact is that we are moving rapidly into into a new future of work, where more people are going to be doing what you and I are doing now. They're going to be online, where more people are going to be doing jobs that are related to what that technology brings towards us. That was going to happen anyway, and that means that we're going to have to put a lot of investment in training people for those jobs and getting them ready for those jobs. A lot of this is about people. A lot of this is about preparing people for those changes, making them resilient enough so that the skills that they carry on with them can be moved into this new world that we're rapidly moving into. Climate change and the so-called green economy is all just a part of that as well. It's saying that we need to live within our natural limits. We need to be able to embrace a regenerative economy that actually contributes to the improvement of our natural environment rather than having a negative impact on it. In terms of what those jobs will look like, I'm not going to get into a crystal ball thing here, but what I can tell you is about what some of those jobs already are looking like. We're seeing many more jobs move into the ICT sector and into technology. I can just see that accelerating. If you think about what New Zealand does well, what we can do is we can export weightlessly if we can do more in software and services. That just makes a lot of sense. Also, what we can do is we can continue to drive fantastic food that we export more efficiently. So I think we're going to continue to need people in those kinds of jobs in the way that Ian's describing. And then finally, I think what used to be called knowledge, but I think which we probably describe more fairly as all of those services and technologies that relate to things that are produced digitally, we need to be doing a lot more in that space. That reduces our carbon footprint done well, and it means that we can be more productive and therefore we make more money. What that means, though, is that we need to change. We need to recognise that training people for today's jobs is not the way ahead. It's training people for the jobs that will be there in 5 and 10 years' time.
Right, moving on to our last question, and it's for you, Alison. The Interim Climate Change Commission has said that we have significant untapped green energy sources, perhaps up to 200% more than we have today. What needs to happen to increase both demand and supply of green electricity?
We've just released a report, Whakamana i Te Morihiko, Enabling Energy Futures, and in there we outline about 10 things that we think have to happen. So we believe now the case has been made, we've signed up as a bipartisan agreement to a zero carbon 2050 future. We've got commitments to meet the Paris for 2035. Let's just get on 2030, beg your pardon, and make it happen. So there's policy changes and regulatory changes. We've identified that things like the RMA reforms could help us, and in response to a previous question, be more agile, get faster, without compromising the need for the right consultation to get things happening. We need to, as Transpower, get on and be more agile, get ourselves sorted out, put forward our net zero carbon grid plans out there. We need to make sure we have the right incentives for people to invest in generation, to get the new renewables happening. We can do a lot around incentivising people to move into, so the transport fleet decarbonising, going to electric vehicles, taking coal out of processed heat to conversion to other forms, whether it's biomass, electricity. We need to help make sure that we have the right incentives available for that. We are quite keen to see the government help put some of this funding into contestable funds to get the most cost-effective zero abatement coming out of the market, to really kickstart and remove some of those barriers such as capital to getting some of these things underway. So there's a lot that can be done, and it's an exciting future out there, and I'm very much into this. We can and we absolutely need to rebuild after COVID, and we need to get the economy going again, but let's do it in a way that's an and help solve our carbon problem and moving to the net zero carbon and addressing our climate change challenges.
What a wonderful note to end on, and something I'm sure the three of you will all agree with. So Mike, Alison and Ian, thank you so much for joining us. And thanks to everybody at home for joining us, and thank you for your wonderful questions. We'll see you next time on Vision Week New Zealand.
Thank you for your questions, and thanks to Belinda Henley and our panellists. There'll be another panel session and live Q&A on Quality Living NZ tomorrow at the same time. During COVID restrictions, many of us became more appreciative of those walks into clean green spaces and perhaps more aware of the fragility of our environment. We also attracted the attention of the world as a clean green nation that acted decisively. Belinda Henley talked about a sustainable future with the Green Building Council's Future Thinker of the Year 2019, sustainability engineer Kate Boylan.
New Zealand is seen by the rest of the world as this kind of clean green paradise. And I think this whole COVID-19 situation and the way that we have reacted to it and the way our response has gone so far, it's deepening that in the minds of internationals because they're seeing us react quite well, and the response has been quite clean cut, I guess you could say. We've done well on the international stage. We should definitely use that to our advantage. We can be this clean green nation, and we need to use that in our vision because that is a part of who we are as a nation, and I think most New Zealanders appreciate that.
And is it really important more than ever that we're really putting sort of a sustainability lens across all those sort of big decisions that we're making?
Yeah, for sure. Maybe it needs to be slightly more ingrained, but thoughts towards environmental, social and cultural outcomes and all of the decisions that we're making in this recovery, I think is hugely important. It's an opportunity to reset. People call this like a once-in-a-lifetime disruption, and that means it's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to reset on a more positive path towards a sustainable future. I think everything needs to include environmental, social and cultural. What kind of outcomes, or what are the issues that would arise, or the positive outcomes we can have, or the aspects of every decision we make in this recovery. I think that's super important, and it's such a fantastic opportunity that we're seeing now to start doing that. I think it needs to be ingrained in every decision in this recovery.
One of the things that Sir Stephen Tindall talked about was the fact that now is our opportunity to really make this push towards 100% renewable energy. How do you think we can get there, and how important is that we act now?
We're so lucky already to have such a high proportion of our electricity generation being from renewable sources. I think if we're going to start seeing the rise of electric cars and things that require more and more electricity, that's going to be even more important because we can't be relying on fossil fuels to fill that last 10% of our electricity usage. Not more importantly, but I think it's super important as well not to lose sight of the other areas of emissions. I think the agricultural sector, we talk about a just transition, and we need it to be a just transition towards a regenerative future. Not one that takes from nature, but goes with it, regenerative and not exploitive. I think electricity is important, but we also need to keep mind to those other sectors that have a lot more of our emissions.
Talking about that investment in infrastructure, where would you like to see that money being spent?
I think the shovel-ready projects scare me a little bit, and many people, because they're not necessarily projects with good environmental practice or good environmental outcomes, or social or cultural for that matter. Climate change is going to be another very, very large disruption, but confusingly to the general public, it's going to be a slow-moving beast in comparison to what COVID was. But we are aware that climate change is happening, and we are aware of some of the infrastructure that we are going to need for that future. So can we use this money to go into projects that we know
going to need to happen. For example, the decarbonising of our electricity generation, things like that. We know that needs to happen. So can we pour the money into that now? I'd say the research is already there. We know what we need to do. We kind of just need to make sure that that's the most important thing we're spending our money on.
In yesterday's program, tech entrepreneur Rod Drury spoke about the importance of immediate and decisive action to establish New Zealand's national vision. Today, he talks to Belinda Henley about renewable energy.
Rod, how important is it now more than ever that we really start to ramp up our renewable energy sources?
You know, we're a long way from everyone else, but what we do have is rain and hills, and we're over 80% renewables right now, and until we dramatically reduce the price of electricity, we won't get to 100%, which I think would be all of our goal. So, and if we can do that, imagine being able to, you know, build clean products with really low cost energy, but with a renewable energy. After the VW emissions crisis, all of the big global car manufacturers needed to build electric cars, and we're seeing that happening. But people buying electric cars soon go, hey, that's great, but how did you make them? Well, if you've made those panels with renewable energy, I think that aligns more with people buying those cars. So you can see, you know, with the protein we make, everything we export, if we could be using low-cost renewable electricity to build those products, you know, I think they're worth more on the world stage.
If we see COVID-19 as an opportunity to shake up things across a broad range of sectors, do you think renewable energy is one of those?
Yes, absolutely. It's huge. We have to really think about the climate. I think what's super exciting is that now we can understand that climate change isn't something that's just out there. Quite quickly, these things can happen to us right now, not just our children. So I'm pretty optimistic that's going to drive a whole lot of change. Renewable energy just makes so much sense now because of the climate benefits, and I think that people are going to be far more open and even demanding of countries to have a clear strategy.
For there to be a really broad uptake of renewable energy across, you know, for all of us to switch to whether it be hydro or solar, what roadblocks do you think that need to be removed? I mean, you talk about cost, but what are some of the other things?
Well, what's really interesting is that money's not a roadblock anymore because there's so much money looking for long-term infrastructure to invest in. So if you get the market architecture right, you know, if we need to get $10 billion to build some really nice big new hydro dams, then that is quite possible. And it may be that it's some pumped hydro or some other schemes, but having a good open scheme saying this is the outcome that we want, so therefore can we be mature about the best way to do that? That's the conversation that needs to happen now. And there's really good willingness to do that because I think technology is getting to a point where you can imagine us, you know, flying domestically using electricity in a 10-year time frame. So the time to have that discussion is absolutely now.
Any industries or businesses that you would think would really open up to us if we did get to the point that we were 100% renewable?
Well, I think we get to play in the global transport industry. If we can demonstrate a willingness that we're going to move towards electric transport, so you know, driving, trucks, aviation, then if we're one of the first countries to do that, a whole lot of R&D comes in, you know, working out how the recharging systems work, how you pay for it, all the e-commerce around that. There'd be a whole lot of studies around how it works, how you make it convenient, ride sharing, all of those models. So I think that creates a platform that a whole lot of additional investment takes place on, and then our businesses that are involved with that and involved with smart networks suddenly are able to export those skills for years and years in the future as the rest of the world catches up. So that feels like, you know, something that for the rest of our lives we can absolutely be leading on, which will create massive opportunity for all New Zealanders.
The word sustainability seems to be thrown around a lot and used in a lot of different ways, but it feels to me that it really sits at the core of so many of these discussions we're having about how New Zealand moves on from COVID-19.
Yeah, and I think sustainability, the environment and equality are those key values that separate New Zealand from a whole lot of other places. And again, a large chunk of the world, probably half of each country, completely identifies with those values. But I think we've got it, so probably 80% of us agree with those values, so we can move absolutely faster. And this is where being small and being nimble does allow us to lead.
And on that note from Rod Drury, it's time to leave you. Longer versions, don't forget, of all of our interviews are available on the Vision Week website, visionweek.co.nz. In tomorrow's programme, we'll be looking at our housing, communities and what it takes to deliver equal opportunity to all New Zealanders. Tune into Quality Living New Zealand tomorrow at 10:30. We'll also have another expert panel at 11 and the opportunity for you to have your questions answered live after the discussion. But for now, from the Royal New Zealand Yacht Squadron, here is a preview of tomorrow's programme. Mā te wā.
I'm really concerned that we will end up with a large number of people in this district who don't have an income, in danger of losing a place to live, and I am talking to government about the sort of support that those folk will need.
And it's how we stop that moving from being the understandable and expected frustrations, disappointments, anger, into something that becomes chronic stress and leads to severe mental disorder in the end.
I think the lockdown has, it's cemented the importance of our relationship with our community, right? You see the rise of the student volunteer armies and just people posting on Facebook like, hey, is there anyone in the local vicinity that I can help, or any elderly people without near family that I can help do the shopping with and go out and do the chores.
The built environment, or the sort of urban fabric of our cities, is so important from an environmental resilience perspective.
Iwi are in a position to be able to provide Aotearoa New Zealand with a huge step forward in imagining a new world and a new society.